Hello and welcome to Great Western. In this edition I will be reviewing David Hepworth's book Overpaid, Oversexed and Over There, which is a discussion of the musical British invasion of the 1960s through to the 1980s. David Hepworth has been hugely influential on me. He was the founding editor of Q magazine, which is a rock magazine that was launched in the 1980s, which I believe recently closed. His journalism was absolutely brilliant and he had a great team around him, and for certainly the first 10 years I read every single issue, probably cover to cover. He's also known as a TV presenter of music, and he's famous because he co-presented Live Aid in 1985 and was a host of the Old Grey Whistle Test on the BBC. Overpaid is a serious book, but it's also a humorous book, and it's certainly one for rock fans. It's quite long, and Hepworth doesn't mess around with setting the scene. He assumes that you know that the Beatles were huge in the United States from 1964 onwards. He tells that story, but he doesn't tell the story of their rise to prominence. There's far too many other artists to consider in this book. So that is essentially the starting point for it. Hepworth paints two different worlds, the USA and Great Britain, particularly England and particularly English musicians. And it all kicks off in early 1964 when the Beatles arrive in New York to an enormous amount of hype in a country grieving the fresh wound of President Kennedy's assassination a couple of months earlier. The book covers many artists, and you might be surprised to hear that along with the Beatles, following closely behind was a band called the Dave Clark Five. Now the Dave Clark Five are not sort of legends of rock, and they're not particularly highly regarded, but Hepworth is careful to tell their tale, and he points out how astute Dave Clark was as a businessman, far more astute than the Beatles themselves or their manager Brian Epstein. The Beatles produce A Hard Day's Night, a black and white movie that is a sort of a inside view of their day-to-day lives, although it is a drama. And it's a huge movie. Hepworth is brilliant here, describing how it gave rise to bands such as the Byrds, and how this idea of a band as a gang arose from that film. And Americans and British people, mainly young men, wanted to be in that gang. They wanted to have that closeness and relationship with people who were almost like their brothers. So he explains that so well. And so many of the bands that came later in the 60s, certainly in the United States and also in Britain, were inspired by this idea of being in a gang. Perhaps no more so than the Monkees, who even had a humorous name based on the way that the Beatles misspelled. Closely following the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five are the Rolling Stones, and Hepworth devotes a chapter or so to them, and they occur throughout the book all the way through. He also discusses swinging London, England, and how for a time that became the cultural centre of the world in the 1960s. But then after that the action moves across the Atlantic to San Francisco. There's some great humour here. Describing swinging London, he says, Britain might no longer be the workshop of the world, but it was clearly the place where the world came to get its hair done. There's lots of humour in the book, particularly in the early chapters. If you're looking for lots of quotes from big musical stars, there are some, but he hasn't interviewed anybody specially because Hepworth just has this encyclopedic knowledge of rock. He's covered so many artists and it's a great read. Who else was part of this British invasion, this invasion that he calls skinny men with bad teeth? Herman's Hermits were absolutely massive in the United States, and he makes a great point by saying that they picked up on the younger sisters of those who were into the Beatles just a few years before. So he's got a real grasp, a real analytical grasp of what's been going on. We get the Hollies as well, particularly Graham Nash, of course, because his invasion eventually took the form of Crosby, Stills and Nash. And he describes how he uses Nash as an example of somebody who was sort of trapped in England, trapped in an English band, drinking pints and playing Batley Variety Club. But Graham wants to break free and he wants to smoke marijuana in California and wear a caftan and all that sort of thing. And he does. He actually does. So Hepworth is very astute in picking up on Graham Nash as a sort of living link between the differences between England and the United States. Once again, absolutely excellent. And a very funny quote here describing the attitude of Nash and other English musicians who'd been dabbling in too many drugs in America. If only everybody else could see the world as they had been seeing it since last Tuesday, then even the most tricky problems would be ironed out. Great quote there. Bit like John Lennon saying, all you need is love and everything will be solved. Something that's notable about Hepworth, he debunks all pop star pomposity, and he does it throughout the book. The story of Graham Nash ends again with another funny quote. This was Salford, not Sausalito, as Jennifer Eccles climbs the charts and Graham Nash is just cringing all the way up. After the Hollies and Eric Burdon from the Animals, we get bands that get big in the United States. Led Zeppelin. Hepworth argues that that was a band tailor-made to conquer the United States. Bigger gigs, longer gigs, better light shows, and outrageous behaviour off stage. With modern technology, the bands are now louder than the audiences. This is something the Beatles could only have dreamed of when they played their last gig in 1966. Moving forward, after the enormity of Led Zeppelin, there are discussions about how the Who broke America, how America is the market that you break slowly. It takes time. And he points out how the Who did that over a period of 6 or 7 years, from approximately 1967 to 1975. They were huge, but it's not easy. Somebody else who had to break into the States was Elton John and his songwriting partner Bernie Taupin. Interesting here, Hepworth points out how Wild West Pinner used this duo from Pinner used cultural appropriation of the Wild West. They're pretending to be an authentic American band, really, like The Band. This idea of Wild West authenticity. And one of the big albums there was an album I like, actually, Tumbleweed Connection. But he points out that the railway station featured in this sepia tint on the album cover is actually in West London. or Surrey. So again, you know, Hepworth brings things down to earth, but Elton John and Bernie Taupin cracked the formula and were a success. About halfway through, I feel the book becomes more a series of short essays in the chapter. There's perhaps less of a narrative. I'm not sure why that is. But it's still good. Of course, one of the biggest English acts to break America was David Bowie. Hepworth describes how he did it. And then as the 70s roll on, there is this idea of overreach, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer and bands like that are doing enormous gigs. They're making money in America, but the energy is coming out of the movement. The wheels are falling off. And this, of course, is the precursor to the punk movement. Now, you might not think of punk as part of the British invasion of the United States, but Hepworth makes a good argument that at least the Sex Pistols did get quite a lot of recognition and notoriety in the United States. As we go into the early 1980s, again, Hepworth has his antenna out and he understands the cultural trends. And of course, gigs become slightly less important because MTV comes along and the pop video, the rock video. American music videos and radio stations are now data-driven playlists championed by a man called Lee Abrams. And the first band perhaps to really tap into this, he argues, are U2. So technically not British, but from the British Isles. And instead of having an attitude that had prevailed, we'll show them in America, he points out how U2 weren't condescending like that, but said, we want to work with America, we want to understand America. And of course, U2 were absolutely massive because of their success in America in particular. There is one final British invasion that happens around the time that the U2 are getting big, and I think it's all credit to Hepworth that he spots this. But it's the early 80s, the New Romantics, Boy George and Culture Club, Kajagoogoo, Flock of Seagulls. He makes the argument that it's now dance orientated music, not rock, that is unifying the American music scene and unifying these people to buy British records. Duran Duran, for example, were huge in the United States around this time as well. Sticking with the United States, Bruce Springsteen is a constant presence, and Hepworth uses Springsteen to understand the differences between American and British music groups and artists. And he concludes with some very interesting analysis. First of all, Bruce Springsteen, and then shortly afterwards in the early 80s, Madonna, are American solo artists. But most of the British invasion from the Beatles in 1964 through to the early 80s comes back to that idea that Hepworth describes at the beginning of the band, the gang, the band of brothers, that family. And he's got a point there, hasn't he? Most artists, David Bowie accepted, most artists who made it big in the States were a band. Whereas by the 1980s, for sure, the big successful American artists are solo. And he makes a very compelling point that this is a difference between the British and American psyche. Perhaps British are more reserved, perhaps more willing to work as a team. It's a great book. As I said, it's funny, often very funny, just bringing down pomposity with good down-to-earth humour, taking people back to their roots, pricking balloons of pretension, but also his rock knowledge means that he understands those key moments. I like reading David Hepworth, and I would like to read more of his books. There's another one called Uncommon People, which is absolutely great, and I might do a review on that one as well sometime. So I recommend it to you. I got this for $7.99 on Amazon. That's probably a bit more than I would normally pay for an ebook, but Hepworth's name opens the door. I wasn't disappointed. It's money well spent. I recommend this book to you.